After years covering Staten Island's most high-profile cases, Advance reporter Frank Donnelly is retiring, but not before sharing some of his most memorable experiences from throughout the years.
You have to ask questions, you have to develop sources, and over time, it helps. But it's like anything else. It's like baseball too. Sometimes you learn a new thing. You can be doing this for 20 years, and something comes up you didn't know about it, and you learn something new.
What I can tell you about Frank is he is as professional a journalist as there is in New York City. When it came to covering courts, Frank was one of the finest reporters in the 5 boroughs in any publication. When it comes to mastering the beat, he spent every day in the courthouse chronicling the cases. He was always fair, most importantly. Talk about journalistic integrity. He knew everyone in the courthouse. He knew every case. He was really a master at the court system.
Welcome to the Staten Island Advances from the Scene, a podcast bringing you an inside look at the biggest stories on Staten Island with the reporters who cover them. I'm your host, Erik Bascome, and this week I'm joined by Staten Island Advance court reporter Frank Donnelly to discuss the ins and outs of courtroom reporting and some of the biggest cases he's covered during his tenure. Thanks for joining me today, Frank. It's nice to see you here in person with us. Even before COVID, I feel like you were probably one of the reporters that we saw least because you were always either in court or working out of the Borough Hall office instead of in kind of the traditional newsroom with everyone else. So what's it like kind of being off on your own away from the rest of the staff most of the time?
We have that satellite office down at Borough Hall, which is a huge help. You couldn't do the job without that. But in a way, the people down at the court, you get used to dealing with them every day, so you see them every day. I mean, you're on your own a lot, but you get used to it, there are cases every day, and you follow them, so you're always around people. And I've had a couple colleagues actually work down at Borough Hall for a while too when I was down there. Mira worked down there, and Rachel worked down there as well. So we had some people down there, but for the most part, I wasn't alone. But you get used to it. And you see people, like I say, when you go to court every day, you see people. So it's not like you're isolated.
Right. And like you said, you're always busy because there's always work to be done in this beat particularly, right?
I've worked with Frank for about 22 years here at the Advance. He was a reporter when I was hired as an intern. And I worked with Frank really closely since about 2014 when I managed the breaking news team and the court beat. And what I can tell you about Frank is he is as professional a journalist as there is in New York City. When it came to covering courts, Frank was one of the finest reporters in the 5 boroughs in any publication when it comes to mastering the beat. He spent every day in the courthouse chronicling the cases. He was always fair, most importantly. Talk about journalistic integrity. He knew everyone in the courthouse. He knew every case. He was really a master at the court system in terms of filings. I learned a lot from Frank. I learned everything from Frank is how to find where to go for the information that you need in order to be accurate and fair, the court filings. Nobody knew that like Frank. He was award-winning. He won awards before he worked with me, and certainly we've won awards together for his coverage of the court beat. And he was always very accurate, very thorough. He was very old-fashioned in that sense. But when the Advance began shifting to SILive and more digitally focused, what's cool about Frank, what I always appreciated is even though that wasn't his area's comfort, Frank shifted that way as well. Whether it was telling stories piecemeal on SILive as they developed, doing videos outside the courthouse. Frank led live chats to sort of enhance his court coverage with attorneys and key players in cases. So even though that wasn't Frank's comfort zone, he shifted his game toward that way, to sort of help us expand our audience and have even hipper, more thorough court coverage on that platform. And that's something that's always pretty cool about Frank. He was always willing to do whatever I asked him to do. Hey, Frank, why don't you take a video outside court? I knew it wasn't his favorite thing to do, but he did it. Hey, Frank, can you line somebody up for this court case? Let's let our readers chat with them online. And Frank, he would do it. So that's what's pretty cool about Frank, and we're going to miss his professionalism and his integrity. Whenever I take on a new journalist on my team at the Advance, they always train with Frank. So in that way, he's passed on, his ability and his expertise to so many members of my team. That was always part of our training process, is you get to spend a couple of days with Frank at court, and see how he approaches that. So we're certainly going to miss Frank. He's deserved his retirement, and I hope he enjoys it. But we're certainly gonna miss him here.
And so, before we dig into your reporting from throughout the years, I wanted to talk a little bit about yourself and how you got here. So I was curious, kind of, are you from Staten Island? Did you always want to be a reporter? Kind of, what led you here to the Advance?
I'm from Brooklyn, and what happened was, this is actually a second career for me. I went into journalism when I was almost 40 years old. I went to night school, journalism school, before I got a job in Pennsylvania in '96 in Pottstown. I was there for 19 months. Then I went to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania for about 26 months. And then I was hired here, and I started here in early 2000. And before that, I had done insurance investigation. I worked for an independent investigator doing insurance investigation. So I kind of had a little bit of knowledge of the court system. And so I became a reporter. And then when I came here, things just kind of happened over time. I was initially a general assignment reporter, and then when John O'Brien, who was our court reporter, he got called to serve in Iraq. He's a lieutenant colonel in the reserves. I took over his beat for about not quite 3 years, and then I was off the beat, and then I came back on the beat.
Wow, yeah. And so when you first started covering courts, what were kind of some of the first major cases that you remember, and what was it like covering it as someone who was kind of new to that beat? You kind of had to step in and fill in for somebody else.
Right. Some of the first cases I covered, I wasn't specifically working the court beat at the time, but I guess I was helping out. There was a murder trial, Elena Kalichis. She was on Toad Hill. She was convicted of killing her husband, who was a Russian oil magnate. And then, of course, in March of 2003. I was at the arraignments for Rennell Wilson, who was killed. The two undercover officers, James Nemerin and Rodney Andrews, during a gun buy. When I was actually on the beat, one of the big cases I did was in 2004. Was Andre Rand. This was a kidnapping case. He was convicted of kidnapping a young girl, Holly Ann Hughes, whose body was never found. He kidnapped her in 1981. And they brought him to trial finally in 2004. Of course, there's no statute of limitations to bring a kidnapping case, because they had developed some additional evidence, particularly a witness who was a key piece in the case. So that was one of the big ones. That was prosecuted by Judge Mario Mattei. He was a prosecutor at that time, and Janet Silvers, who's now his law assistant. That was a big one. And then Julie Hernkind was convicted of manslaughter in the death of her 3-year-old daughter, Selena. She was not convicted of murder, but convicted of manslaughter. This was a case where she and her husband had held the little girl. She was 3 years old. She had soiled herself. They held her underwater in the bathtub, and she asphyxiated.
Wow. That's some heavy topics, and as someone who was kind of new to the beat, what's it like? Is it overwhelming? You're getting thrown these cases of murder, manslaughter, kidnapping. What does it feel like to someone who is just kind of adjusting to that?
Well, I had done some court stuff before that, in and out, so I had an idea what was going on. It's when you first get in, and we covered things differently back in those days. We pretty much covered every criminal trial, so you'd really bounce around from courtroom to courtroom. It can be overwhelming, I suppose. But it's like anything else. You get used to it. You figure out which cases you really need to focus on, and which ones that you don't really have to really go full on at it. So it's like anything else. It's a process, and you get used to it.
Mm-hmm. And so, we mentioned this earlier, because you aren't really in the office as much. You're either in the courtroom or in the Borough Hall office. I'm curious, kind of what does an average workday look like for you? Can you just kind of walk our listeners through a day in the life?
Yeah, I mean, I go in to Borough Hall, and then I'll go over to the courtroom. And I keep a list of cases. I keep a calendar every day of cases that I'm following. It's basically by priority. You'll go to one. If this is your high priority for today, you'll go to the courtroom, wait for that case to be called. If that happens, then you may bounce to another courtroom, go to see what's happening there. So sometimes I'm bouncing around between 4 and 5 courtrooms on a given day. And then, at the end of the day, on the state court website, you can track where the cases went if you've missed something. So you can always catch up if you need to. Some days it depends what's happening in court. Some days are busier than others, but it's a pretty busy thing.
Yeah, and I'm curious because a couple of times when you were either out on vacation or whatever it might be, there are still cases going on, right? And so people have to fill in and they have to go cover courts. And I know I've had to do this a couple of times. Some of our other reporters have. And the biggest difference for me was that you're not allowed to record anything while you're in the courtrooms. It's all handwritten notes. And so as a younger reporter who has been kind of taught to record everything every time you're doing any interview, and so it was a big change for me, and it made things a little more stressful, making sure that you had everything right, considering, these are some pretty high stakes stories. We don't want to get sued here. So, what's it like having to report on such these such serious stories using only kind of your notes and your memory?
Well, I never really used a tape recorder much, so even my phone interviews, I would really use a pad and pen. So you try to do the best you can. I mean, you listen as well as you can. You write. You try to take as good notes as you can. You just do the best you can. You really have to concentrate. You have to pay attention. You have to know what's going on. You can't. You just can't have your mind wander. You have to be engaged, and you get used to it after a while. That's not to say you're not going to miss something. Someone may say something, you don't catch exactly what they say. Well, if you don't catch it, then you can't use it.
Right.
So you just try to do the best you can with what you have, and it usually works out fine.
Yeah, and another thing that I find interesting about your beat is that, and you kind of touched on this already, you wind up covering some of these cases that, take place over the course of several years. The process can be long here. So what's it like, to have so much time in between updates at certain points, and how do you keep track of these ongoing cases to make sure you don't miss anything?
Well, again, the thing is I keep a calendar, and then the state court website has a calendar out, so every day you can see, and the calendar you can date whatever. I can date to December 13th today, and I can see on any given judge's docket what they have that day. So I keep a calendar. I write down. I follow the case. So at the end of the day, what happened? It was adjourned to October 19th. So I put October 19th on my calendar. I write the case, and that's the best. That's the way I did it. It's worked well. I mean, there are sometimes we won't write about a case if nothing's happening, because sometimes these cases can take a long time with various motions are filed, decisions if they have pretrial hearings. We don't necessarily cover all that. So you just keep an eye on the calendar, and then you'll go into court sometimes at some point, and then you can find out what's going on. You can ask maybe one of the attorneys, where's the case stand right now, just so you can get an idea of what's going on.
Yeah, and that actually kind of leads perfectly into my next question. So, a big part of any reporter's job is kind of developing relationships with these sources that are relevant to their beat. So for me, I cover transportation, so that's a lot of safe streets advocates, transportation union leaders, everyday commuters, that kind of stuff. So what kind of sources have you been developing over the years, and how does that kind of benefit you in your reporting?
Well, it's mainly attorneys, since it's court, and it's mostly criminal, but I do write some civil cases. So it's a matter of, talking to the lawyers, getting their contact information, developing kind of a trust and a bond with them, that they know they can speak to you about things that, if they tell you something off the record, they know you're not going to write it. So that's a big thing. Also, it's, court personnel, just being friendly with them, just so sometimes if you have a question, hey, is this case going on today? Is that case going on today? They can tell you, yeah, this is happening. That's not happening today. So it's just a matter of, and obviously, like anything else, it takes time to build up those relationships and to get that, to get those contacts.
Yeah, and for me, one of kind of the scarier things about covering courts is the fact that I'm not exactly well versed in like the legalese or the judicial process, all that kind of nitty gritty of it. So some of those court documents, I mean, just reading through those, very dense, very tough to read, trying to make heads or tails of. So what was it like early on for you, kind of learning all that stuff? And for me, it often feels a bit daunting.
Well, like I said, I had previously worked as an insurance investigator. And we also did trial prep work. So what we did is a lot of, especially for defense firms. So what we did, I over the years I read a lot of court documents in that capacity. So I had an idea, especially with civil stuff, although some of that stuff is incredibly complex. And with the criminal stuff, even though before I did the court beat, I did a lot of criminal stuff too. And so you after a while you get the complaints and you read them and you understand. I mean, the other thing is just asking questions. A lot of times you go to a lawyer and say, hey, listen, or you go to the DA's office and say, what is this? And what does it mean? And, they'll tell you. I mean, they'll tell you whether you can put it on the record or off the record. Yeah. But that's the big thing. It's you have to ask questions. You have to develop sources. And over time, it helps. But it's like anything else. It's like baseball, too. Sometimes you learn a new thing. You can be doing this for 20 years, and something comes up you didn't know about it, and you learn something new. But again, it's the whole thing is asking questions, going online. There's resources online you can look up. So it's doing all those things that really help.
We'll be right back. The Mayor of Maple Avenue is a powerful multi-part podcast about Sean Sinisi, a victim of former Penn State football coach Jerry Sandusky, who was arrested 10 years ago for numerous child sexual abuse charges. The podcast series is written and hosted by Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter Sarah Ganim, who takes listeners into the world of addiction rehabilitation, where society can be quick to celebrate the consequences for abusers while not addressing the needs of their victims. Subscribe now to The Mayor of Maple Avenue wherever you get your podcasts. Yeah, and something that all reporters deal with in some way, shape, or form is backlash on some of their stories from community members who probably aren't thrilled with the way that they might be being presented publicly. And so I imagine those criticisms can be kind of harsh for you when you're writing about things like court cases and convictions. So over the years, I'm curious, have you received any angry letters or emails from friends or families of the people that you write about, and how do you kind of handle those?
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, you get your share. They seem to come in bunches. You go a long time without one, and then all of a sudden you'll get a few in a row. It depends. It depends on the tone of the email. I mean, some emails you just know that no matter what you say, the person's not gonna be happy with what you say, and so it's like it's a venting thing. I think a lot of times, so I just let them vent, and I won't respond. Sometimes if they're challenging a factual thing that you wrote, and you have the document, and you know what's right, you might write back and say, hey, listen, this comes from a criminal complaint, or this was said in court. It's not like I made this up. So it's that's kind of the way we've tried to handle it. It's a difficult thing at the time, and it's understandable. It's people have their friends, their relatives out there. They don't want to read. They don't want to see stuff written about them that's bad. But unfortunately, that's our job. I mean, the public wants to know. The public has a right to know about these things, and so that's what we do. So yeah, it's kind of part of the job. It's obviously not one that you really relish, but you just have to kind of deal with it.
Yeah, and courtrooms can sometimes be kind of emotional and dramatic places, especially depending on what the case is. So I'm curious, what are some of kind of the most memorable experiences for you? Anything that really stood out?
A lot of times, it's trials, but a lot of times it's sentencings, because there can be, depending on the case, they can have a victim impact statement, so a family member of the victim can speak, or the victim himself or herself can speak. And sometimes those are the most emotional and moving things. One of the thing that I remember was, it had to be 15 years ago at least. There was a case where a young driver, I think a guy was in his 20s, he hit and killed a young boy who was maybe 8. And the victim's father gave an emotional statement, victim impact statement, and then the defendant himself gave an emotional, because the defendants are allowed to speak before they're sentenced. He gave an emotional statement where he apologized to the family, and the boy's father said to the defendant, "I forgive you." Wow. And it's hard to even control yourself when you hear that, not to break down. But that was one of the most emotional things I've seen. And like I said, and there have been others. Again, sentencings are can be very emotional, especially if it involves the death.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, before we go, I know that our colleague Kyle Lawson is slated to kind of take over your role as courts reporter once you do retire. So I was wondering what kind of advice or training that you've been kind of giving him to try and prep him for that role.
Well, we've been talking about it. He's going to shadow me this week in court. I mean, I think the most important thing that would pertain to him, and really to any reporter, is be accurate, be fair, obviously write as good a story as you can, and make contacts. Be friendly with everyone down at court. I mean, if you're good to them, they'll be good to you. If you need help with something, they'll help you out. I think that's really the best thing you can do, and be observant. That's probably the most important thing when you're in a courtroom, is be observant. Keep your eyes, keep your ears open. There's a lot of things that go on. I mean, there's a lot of things you can't report about because it's off the record. But if you have your eyes and ears open, then it may give you a little more information, a little more background about the case that you don't know, and that'll help in your reporting. And I think he'll be fine.
Yeah, and he's certainly got big shoes to fill. But, thank you so much for joining me today, Frank. I appreciate you coming on here before you ride off into the sunset. So I hope you enjoy your retirement.
Thank you. My pleasure, Eric. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Staten Island Advances from the Scene. If you like what you've heard, please make sure to rate and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and visit SILive.com for the latest on all these stories and more. Thank you for supporting local journalism.